Hello, my name is Kaylin Jason, and I work for Hager Sharp, a communications firm in Washington, D.C. I support communications and outreach efforts for the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. NAEP is administered by the National Center for Education Statistics within the Institute of Education Sciences, our host for this two-day reading summit. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Ebony Elizabeth Thomas and her session, Engaging K-12 Students with Literature. Dr. Thomas is Associate Professor in the Literacy, Culture, and International Education Division at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. Dr. Thomas is an expert on children's literature, youth media, and fan culture. She is a former Detroit Public Schools teacher and National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow. She was a member of the NCTE Cultivating New Voices Among Scholars of Color's 2008-2010 cohort. She served on the NCTE Conference on English Education's Executive Committee from 2013 until 2017, and she is a past chair of the NCTE Standing Committee on Research. Currently, she serves as co-editor of the NCTE journal, Research in the Teaching of English. Dr. Thomas has written and co-authored more than 25 articles and book chapters in numerous academic journals and edited volumes. She has also published 2 books, Reading African American Experiences in the Obama Era, Theory, Advocacy, Activism, and most recently, The Dark Fantastic, Race in the Imagination from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. Unfortunately, Dr. Thomas will be unable to join us for a live Q&A session following today's pre-recorded presentation, but you can contact Dr. Thomas by email at ebonyt@upenn.edu. Again, that's ebonyt@upenn.edu. Or if you leave your questions in the chat along with your contact information, we'll forward your questions along. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Ebony Thomas.
Hello, my name is Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, and I am so happy to be with you this afternoon. Currently, I am in transit. I am moving house and moving cities and states. I'll talk more about that at the end of the presentation. But I am so pleased to have been invited by IES to share with you on the topic of engaging K-12 students with literature. I've subtitled this presentation Notes Toward an Unfinished Project because I really am at that juncture of my research. So for the past 10 years, I've really been thinking a lot about discourse in the ELA classroom. And then about 7 years ago, I turned more intensely to a lifelong area of interest and personal study, which is children's and young adult literature. That's all coalesced into having some particular ideas about where the field is right now when it comes to thinking about the role of literature, books, stories, poetry, drama in literacy and ELA classrooms during the 2020s, or as we're moving into the 2020s. There's been lots of consideration of writing, pedagogy, and assessment. Colleagues who I value work on digital literacies. I collaborate and think alongside them. However, students are still learning how to read and write with good old-fashioned stories, whether they are reading physical books or hardcovers, paperbacks, or if they are using tablets and laptops and screens, which is perhaps much more common now, even before the pandemic, we found that to be the case. We don't have enough research on how students are making sense of literature in the digital age. So I'm going to not be with you for very long, but I am really excited about going over some of where my work is right now. We imagine the literacy and English language arts curriculum to be many of the things that you see on the screen here. So my own program title at Penn reflects this. So, right, so our program for master's and doctoral students is titled Reading, Writing, Literacy. And you see all of those words on this slide. We also consider literacy and ELA to encompass listening, viewing, speaking. We see it as cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary. It is communicative. We talk a lot about multimodality. It is multicultural, it's interactive, it's dynamic. The list could go on and on. I've begun thinking of this as our imagined literacy ELA curriculum. So we do many of these things in our classrooms from coast to coast and even beyond the contiguous 48 states. We are doing many of these things in classrooms, and as teacher educators at colleges and universities, this is sort of our bread and butter. However, beyond the imagined literacy ELA curriculum, I would argue there's also the observable literacy ELA curriculum. So I've taken observable from this idea of the observable universe. So we have what is imagined, what is theoretical, what is ideal, but then we also have what is observable. And what is observable, I think, is really well characterized by Australian linguist Francis Christie's idea from over 20 years ago that in former, I guess, British Empire countries, I don't know of a better way to describe them. So the US, the UK, Australia, etc. So places that are part of the West, but also if you even think about countries beyond that, the point of literacy and ELA, especially beyond early reading and writing instruction, is really the development of this idea of a shared ethical position. Alan Luke, more than 15 years ago, noted in the 2005 special edition of English Education that English education is one of the most, if not the most contested site in the curriculum. And Christie agrees. And so therefore, what you find when you sit and observe reading and English language arts classrooms from elementary through middle, all the way up to high school, is that what you're doing is you're negotiating ideas about society. And you see some of what I've been wrestling with, I would even say beyond the past decade, since I was a doctoral student in the 2000s. Just really thinking about how teachers and students are developing consensus around shared ethical positions with the goal toward making this literate citizenry. And that has very deep roots. So here you see a bit about ideologies that underpin the teaching of literature. Time does not permit me to go into all of these in depth. I've done this, study for not only my dissertation, but I also talk a lot about it as a professor and as a workshop leader, thinking about what's really behind the ELA curriculum, especially beyond, say, 5th and 6th grade. So once kids are reading, even at a very basic level, once kids are able to write, then what are we doing for the next 7 to 10 years or more? If you think about undergrad and grad school, you're really socializing kids into a particular kind of society. And the kind of society that you're socializing them into really is in part conveyed through the books that are chosen for the curriculum, whether it's by the teacher, the school, the district, a consulting company, etc. And you also see that over time, our ideologies that underpin the teaching of literature have shifted. So we've moved from basic skills, through thinking about cultural heritage, although like a zombie or like, some horror film monster, that's coming back. So, so the purpose of English and of the school curriculum is not to inculcate students with critical thinking skills or with criticality. It is to pass down or transmit culture. That is a cultural heritage point of view. And many of you in the audience will be familiar with Edie Hirsch and cultural literacy. We move on to the progressives like Louise Rosenblatt, who I really have used as the foundation for my work with Amy Storniolo on restoring. So thinking about, the reader's journey, thinking about the role of identity. The linguistic turn influenced how we teach reading and writing and other subjects under the LiteracyELA umbrella, especially after that turn in the 1980s. The cultural studies folks really influenced how we teach ELA. The new literacy studies, including my late great colleague who was adjunct at Penn, Brian Street, Jen G, Shirley Bryce Heath. And then multiliteracies folks have really influenced the way that we think about digital literacies. To that, I will add something that I did not have on this chart, which is from my dissertation 11 years ago, which is asset-based pedagogies, which I have written about extensively in more recent years. So thinking about culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally relevant pedagogy, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Geneva Gay, Carol Lee, culturally sustaining pedagogy, Django Paris, and historically relevant pedagogy, Golnasar Muhammad. So thinking about using the student's own culture as a foundation for teaching books. So these are some of the ideologies that underpin the teaching of literature. And especially during our politically contested era, I think it's really important for us as researchers, as educational consultants, as teachers, as administrators, as interested parties to be very clear on the ideologies that we are using to design curriculum and assessment. In addition, we've been having lots of conversations about diversity, equity, and representation all over the culture. And children's and young adult books are no exception. We certainly have had those conversations over the past decade in my corner of the world. That conversation had been occurring for centuries before the present, as one of my mentors, UIUC Professor Emerita Violet Harris, admonished me to say. So we have always had these conversations about accurate representation of children of color and other kids from the margins and their families and their communities in books, textbooks, and curriculum. Around 2014, we saw the culture shift toward talking about these matters in the children's publishing industry and in Hollywood, so we've just seen it everywhere. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is one of the voices during that moment pointed out that diversity is not enough. And we have seen that from more radical educators and reformers. So can we change the system that exists to include more voices? So that means, do we just add more authors of color, more diverse books, or does the system fundamentally need to change? This slide is a stand-in for an entire workshop or talk that I can build to, to fit any container, but I will move on because the conversation today is about how we engage kids. How do we engage kids when there are many adults invested in them not having access to certain books at all? This is one of many controversies that have reached the news. So every year we see districts, not just in Mississippi, but all over the country, will object. So either parents will object, usually it's parents or community members. There is concern about the kinds of books that are in our kids' hands. So even a classic like To Kill a Mockingbird these days is getting a lot of heat from both sides of the political aisle. So we have conservatives who feel that the book makes people uncomfortable and that we should not talk about such matters. What might be surprising is that you also have a growing number of people to the left who are also saying that we need to reconsider the teaching of To Kill a Mockingbird, because it is very much an artifact of its time. So what seems like revolution back during the time of its publication, almost a century later, leaves many students uncomfortable. Canadian journalist Andre Demise has actually written a few essays about being the only Black student in a classroom and being made to read To Kill a Mockingbird, and how uncomfortable that experience was. And especially because as classrooms become more integrated, there isn't a lot of research on the psychological and social consequences of putting, books about race relations into classrooms where one or a few Black children or teens are asked to be the, racial representative for everyone. And those are experiences that they recount long after leaving formal education. It is something to think about. There are some challenges that we find when we are looking toward literary and textual justice, something I think about every day. And I think that if you consider the books that a child reads from K through 12, all of them, I believe that, and I'm hoping to do the research soon to get empirical evidence for this next statement. I think that we have some trouble when we think about from birth to maybe age 18. So the first stories, maybe not birth, but from a child's initial encounter with story all the way through young adulthood. What are they learning about themselves? What are they learning about the other, so other people in the world? What are they learning about society? This is what I found as I leave year 11 in the professoriate and year 22 in education. Here are some challenges I've seen. Likability. First, I have found as a teacher and as a researcher, especially though I haven't done large scale research yet, but in my smaller classroom studies, that often kids say that Black characters, settings, and narratives aren't likable. Now, this is, of course, something that we found with students who are white or who are not Black, but even Black children sometimes don't want to read about, for instance, enslaved characters. More about that in a minute. Black characters, settings, and narratives are sometimes seen as not relatable. So it is not the kind of story that you want to lose yourself in if, the story recounts racial violence. It is something that you want to hold at a distance from yourself or remove. So again, thinking about the psychological and social consequences or weight, I shouldn't say consequences, but the weight of having the book in the curriculum. I believe we should teach this literature. I believe we need to be more honest about the weight, especially now. Sometimes the books are accused of mimicking. So you may have seen adaptations of, say, for instance, Romeo and Juliet that have been written by Black authors. We have a few. Sharon Draper and E.B. Zavoy come to mind. They have both written excellent and award-winning adaptations of Romeo and Juliet. But then others complain, well, that's not ours. You know, these are just imitative of white narratives. We've also seen that beyond the classroom and beyond traditional literature. And that accusation has been leveled at Hollywood, you know, so thinking about Miles Morales as Spider-Man. And there is an undercurrent of, well, we need our own heroes. I'm working on the next two ideas, you know, through a number of publications that I have that are in press and that are in preparation. You know, there's a location problem. So Black characters, settings, and narratives, because they typically deal with either painful history or painful contemporary society, when a Black character moves out of place and is existing somewhere else, then they're seen as not belonging over there or back then. So if you show up in unexpected places, if the character is not supposed to be doing that, then the reader has a hard time suspending disbelief. And I was just thinking about, okay, this is a quantum problem. I've tweeted about it, I've talked about it probably for the past 5 years or more. Like, you know, Houston, we have a quantum problem. So how do we get people to imagine differently? Also, I think that Black characters, settings, and narratives are not liberated from the imperatives of racial justice, because racial justice is an imperative. We cannot continue as we have, you know, something's going to give or has to give. But, you know, when children want a sense of play or imagination, a flight of fancy, or even to learn something that isn't about the racial burden, you know, there is this imperative. So I think it suspends the readers, especially young Black readers, but all readers, when it comes to considering race in the books and stories they read, in this sense of hyper reality, because the imperatives of the present must come before vision and the imagination. And what we're doing is, because we are now educating the next generation, so the people in K-12 classrooms today, unless the sun goes nova or there's some asteroid, they're going to be around in 2100. Some of the children alive today will be the elders of the year 2100. So we are influencing the 22nd century and precluding vision and imagination. Now, I will say I'm finding promise in the current, what I'm calling the Afrofuturistic Renaissance, and also taking heart in Latinx futurisms, indigenous futurisms, queer futurity, and all kinds of different futures. So the rise of science fiction, fantasy, and comics is important, because we do need to imagine desperately ourselves out of the present. However, so often we're not finding good ways to balance. When we look at the literature curriculum that is currently in United States schools, we're not looking at how we balance, you know, all of these elements together. This affects how others see us. And here you'll see White Supremacy in Children's Literature, which was a 1998 book by Donna Ray McCann, who was an important library scholar or school library media specialist. Absolutely essential book. And then my own, The Dark Fantastic, Race and the Imagination, from Harry Potter to the Hunger Games. So this is a growing body of literature where we're looking at this topic. And then one of the things I've been a little obsessed with over the past decade, well, actually all my life, is just thinking about the way that Black characters show up in what I'm calling non-owned voices stories, as either enslaved, surviving segregation, perpetually fighting for our humanity, stereotypical, magical, deviant, or adultifying. So this is a double-edged sword. It is important to show the past. We have seen, because of the unprecedented awful attacks against the 1619 Project and other recent curriculum interventions, we have seen the necessity of teaching slavery. I myself have been part of SPLC's Teaching Tolerance Task Force on the teaching of slavery in the United States for the past 5 or 6 years. So I do believe it's important to teach these things. However, balance, especially, given the continuing burden of racism and other forms of inequality in our society, I think that we're not quite considering the full weight of the literature curriculum for our kids. So when asked to present on engagement and how we engage kids, I think it is important for us to continue moving toward, stories where students can see themselves in ways that are more transformative and not necessarily stereotypical. So for instance, if we're going to present slavery, thinking about ways to humanize those enslaved characters is essential. More on that in a minute. My program of research includes some of what you see here. So this is the part of it that is really about literature. I also work on discourse, and I work on something that we're calling restorying, and thinking alongside digital and media scholars. But this is kind of the lane I've been traversing by myself for a decade, or, as far as non-collaborative research. So first is the Dark Fantastic, where I theorized what was going on in traditional science fiction fantasy that often permeated, the fun stories that kids had in classrooms. My current book project is the Shadow Book. I'm trying to think about the weight of slavery and enslavement in children's books and media. May consider textbooks, but I think my colleagues in social studies have that lane. So in ELA, we still are covering a lot of historical material. However, history isn't the same, enterprise as thinking about English language arts and literacy. So I think I'll stay over thinking about children's literature and also media, or ways that it is adapted for screen. And of course, I've been a visible advocate for thinking about how we can promote diverse stories for every child through my Humanizing Stories initiative and through a lot of my other work with organizations. Because our time is short today, I want to talk about some of the challenge of why we need to think about what is in classrooms for kids. Slavery with a Smile was a hashtag that went viral in the winter of 2016. It was all about, and it led to a project where we began thinking about the cultural politics of race in children's literature. So, again, time does not permit me to really delve into my 10 years of research on slavery and children's literature that I'm hoping to write up in part in the Shadow Book, but also for some articles, corralling that work and getting, myself, my research assistants, getting everything coded. We've read hundreds of children's books on enslavement because we want to see what was going on, because, children's literature before 1970 really was rife with the culture of the times, for lack of a better word. So not just race, on gender, on class, on sexuality, on nationality, it reflected those times. So I'm not going to use the word, it's not woke, because I'm so tired of the appropriation of woke from Black vernacular. I wish that, we almost had code language so we can hide some of these things so that they don't get twisted, right? But the literature that many of us would like to, many people would like for us to go back to, which is a more traditional literary curriculum with books published before 1970 or 1980. that literature reflects the times. And we find that authors and illustrators who grew up on that literature are often influenced by it, which is why I'm so passionate about what I do. You know, I don't just see it as, oh, she's a children's literature scholar. I think that the books and the stories that kids read and the films and the television shows that they view, I believe even YouTube and TikTok will influence what the early 22nd century is like. The proof is all around you. People who grew up with literature that portrayed other people negatively, people who grew up with literature that showed that some people mattered more than others, are treating those people in the same way today in the 2020s. So therefore, when we saw A Fine Dessert, and it was a book I did not know about until the controversy, because we had, you know, before this came out, we had hoped to close our database. We were trying to look at all the children's books that dealt with slavery within the United States up through, I think it was 1970 to 2013 or something. But we kept having to open up the database because we kept finding books that were published in the 2010s that were problematic. This is one of those books, A Fine Dessert, 4 centuries, 4 families, 1 delicious treat. It was universally positively reviewed up until the controversy. So let me tell you a little bit about this book. Oops, let me go back. So this book featured 4 families throughout 4 time periods, preparing and enjoying a traditional colonial US dessert called Blackberry Fool. I won't get into the other 3 families. The 19th century family was a Black enslaved mom and her daughter who prepared the Blackberry Fool for their master's table in his family. And there's a double page spread where you have a fan. I wish I had included this slide in retrospect. There's a small boy manning the fan, as you know, you may have seen in movies of that period. And the mother and daughter are serving the family. And then on the next page, you see the mother and daughter enjoying some of the dessert in the closet. What a delicious treat. And people were outraged by it because the other 3 families and the other 3 time periods prepared the food for themselves and enjoyed it. So you have the mom and child who are only shown serving and then sneaking the dessert. And so the challenge with the book was that the structure of the book, it's not that the story itself didn't happen. It certainly did. The problem with the story was that it was out of balance with showing all the other families are free, they're enjoying, these are relatable situations where people are sitting around a table, and yet the one time you see a Black family or a Black mother and child, they're enslaved and they're serving, and that does send subconscious messages, and they're smiling. And then the next book was A Birthday Cake for George Washington, which was all about Hercules, which you may have heard more about, especially recently. George Washington's enslaved folk at Mount Vernon and here in Philadelphia. And the challenge here was you can't just say, oh, it's white creators or white authors and illustrators who are doing this. This was an all women of color team. But again, we've all been raised with the same body of literature and media, and subconsciously certain things slip through. So here is the double page spread. I did include it, where you see the little boy who's manning the fan, and you see the mom and daughter diligently serving the family. Did this scene happen throughout the South? I believe they're in South Carolina in the book. Of course it happened. Is this inherently bad to show what happened? No, this actually is part of our nation's history. But in a book purporting to show for family and not commenting at all in the text or acknowledgments. Why showing the mom and the daughter, we don't know if the son is hers or another little boy in the plantation. This is problematic. And here is the place where you have the mom and daughter hiding in the closet. Now, A Birthday Cake for George Washington was all about Hercules, and it basically does not evaluate enslavement at all. It just relates the story of a very special birthday party that was had for George Washington. Now, I've written in another piece about George Washington's slaveholding. It's almost completely obscured from children's literature. Even the most recent books, as of 2018, when that article was published, you barely see anything that evaluates or even depicts Washington as a slave owner, although that was the source of his wealth. So you have, Martha, who's very happy at Hercules. We know a year later, Hercules ran away, right? So Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar wrote Never Caught, which is a National Book Award finalist. And no, the Washingtons were not a benevolent, they weren't benevolent Virginia planters. They actually were quite traditional, large plantation owners who were enslavers. And they pursued relentlessly their folks who ran away. They circulated people between Philadelphia and Virginia so that they would not become automatically free, because Philadelphia at the time of Washington's presidency was part of a free state, Pennsylvania. So by then, Pennsylvania had manumitted slaves. And so therefore, if you were in Pennsylvania for 6 months continuously, you were freed by the law. And so what the Washingtons would do is send people back to Mount Vernon so that that wouldn't happen. So of course, folks ran away. And we have researchers recently found proof that Hercules fled Mount Vernon on February 22nd, 1797. As best we can determine, the book that you see, A Birthday Cake for George Washington, that must have been the year before, because that was the time in which he would have been, all the events line up. So no, people may not have been smiling. Hercules and some of the other enslaved Virginia chefs were trained in France, some of them, and they were among those who were the foundation of United States cookery or the culinary tradition in this country. Some of the food they made, including baked macaroni and cheese, others that became staples in the US diet, were brought here and first laid at those tables of state by these men, enslaved men and women. And so therefore, it is egregious to obscure that from a children's book, because what will happen is people will read people will read A Birthday Cake for George Washington as kids. They will get Never Caught in high school or college, and guess which version of events will prevail? Probably the first version, huh? We're seeing that now all throughout the culture. I've written a couple of articles on this. Both are available from my academia.edu page. I'm hoping to publish more, continuously publishing more. And again, I am working on the shadow book. So this leaves us with a question: what do you do if you're both the haunted and the haunt? Toni Morrison, in Playing in the Dark, famously said that, the signing, abiding Africanist presence haunts all of literature in the United States. That includes literature for children and teens. And so what do you do when your presence is the ever-present shadow of the Western imagination? You're always in folks' head. And how does that happen? I've been thinking about that. I think maybe a question we need to pursue is how we see ourselves. So others see us a certain way because of stories, and stories shape the imagination. How do we see ourselves? Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is a place where I got the title for my book. So my book title, The Shadow Book, pays homage to Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop's Shadow and Substance, Afro-American Experience in Contemporary Children's Fiction. It was the first academic book of its kind that really traced out a children's literary tradition. It came out in 1982. And also, she used Sojourner Truth's famous statement, "I sell the shadow to support the substance," to think about, you know, sort of this signing, abiding, shadowed presence in books. And so I really have been thinking that through. I have also been thinking about sort of connections among the present and the past. Remember, early in the presentation, I talked about sort of the quantum issue, and that issue leads to student disengagement with some of the books that they're required to read. So Imani Perry's May We Forever Stand is such an amazing book. It's a history of the Black national anthem. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has brought us. And so I'm thinking about those songs that our ancestors sang, those songs that prominent Black educators, other multicultural educators, educators of color, queer educators. So thinking about whose shoulders on which we stand. And I love Earth, Wind, and Fire. So I just decided to put, you know, sing a song in the presentation. Wish I could play the music for you. So again, we're singing songs full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Nothing that I've said in this presentation means that I am critiquing the wonderful elders and ancestors and living geniuses who have provided this tradition for us. So we honor all of them. We say their names: Virginia Hamilton, Tom Feelings, W.E.B. Du Bois, Jessie Fawcett, Mildred Taylor, Eloise Greenfield. I could go on and on and on and on. And so many living folks: Nikki Grimes, Rita Williams Garcia, Jacqueline Woodson, Renee Watson. Again, the beat goes on and on and on. We value those folks. We love those folks. But we also sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. There has never been a time like this in children's and young adult literature when it comes to traditional publishing. All of a sudden, all these myriad manifestations of Black childhood and teen life are all over our bookshelves. This has happened since I've been a professor. It has happened really over the past 5 to 7 years. And it has been because of the work of the hard work of hundreds of advocates, pushing the industry relentlessly, not only using social media, engaged in behind the scene campaigns you might have never heard about. And I'm so happy that all of these authors, many of whom are amazing friends and colleagues, are writing such incredible books. We need to find ways to bring these books into the curriculum, especially at times of budget cuts. So alongside thinking about how we teach about racial justice, we can also acknowledge the fact that Black children are children. Black teens are teens coming of age. And the beautiful thing about all these stories is that everything that is here on the screen, it teaches history, it teaches folklore, you have commentary on contemporary society. You can provide this through the contemporary vision of current authors and illustrators. And we just want to see much more of this work in the curriculum. Black kids and teens aren't just readers who are overshadowed by like sort of these gap ideologies. I call them like there's the achievement gap. So the kids just aren't really achieving well on tests. How come they won't read? And Ebony, why do you care more about what's in the books than whether kids can read or not? We're not thinking about sort of this imagination gap, so that we are requiring kids who are shown in stories very often, especially early stories, in the ways that I've noted, and they have throughout time. You know, so we're expecting the same outcomes as kids who are shown up very differently in those stories, right? So we're not thinking about the extra psychological burden that a young Black child might have to overcome, even subconsciously, because some researchers have said, well, Ebony, they don't have any, consciousness or knowledge of race. And here's the study to prove that 5-year-olds don't care about the race of the characters in a book. Well, I have talked to countless people, and again, I'm planning on launching my first encounter study, who later on in life, they didn't even realize what that initial encounter did to them, because they haven't yet fully developed or formed their identities. And so I think it's important for us to look at what the kids are gravitating to. I've been asked to talk about reading engagement. Let's look at what kids are doing. They're innovative co-creators of stories they've read. They are contributing imaginatively to fictional stories, and they are transforming them all together. Don't just take my word for it. So one of the things I want to know is, what stories are they already telling about their lives and the world around them, about their wildest dreams? We're seeing this all over the internet, especially Black tweens and teens. I mean, there would be no social media without it. They drive so much of the traffic on TikTok, before that, the Vine, and we see them on Twitter. They are really changing society through art, through their politics, through their writing, through the ways that they were telling stories. And for the past 6 or 7 years, Amy Storiano and I have been really trying to theorize and think about this alongside our doctoral students. And I do wonder what this might teach us about text selection, text complexity, reading to motivation, and reading assessment. These are all things that I wish more research would consider. Here are some resources for teaching about Black children's and young adult literature. There's just so much, especially now. I highly recommend picking up Goldie Muhammad's Cultivating Genius, which is one of the most brilliant frameworks for thinking about how we bring some of what I've talked about into the classroom. April Baker Bell's Linguistic Justice is an award-winning, amazing book, but we think about the kind of language that our kids are bringing with them into the classroom. If you want to know more about the histories of children's literature, especially in this corner or this area, I would recommend Michelle Martin's Brown Gold, which covers picture books, Kate Capshaw-Smith's Children's Literature of the Harlem Renaissance, Ebony Jr., which tells you a little bit about periodicals, and of course, the aforementioned Dr. Bishop's Free Within Ourselves, The Development of African American Children's Literature, is a comprehensive overview. Wanda Brooks and John McNair's important book, Embracing, Evaluating, and Examining, long presentation, African American Children's and Young Adult Literature, is really important, for thinking about selection and evaluation. And finally, Well-Read Black Girl is also, it's new. It's about what people are reading, especially Black teens and young adults. And I could have given this presentation for just about any facet or kind of difference that you might imagine. Of course, my focus is in African American children's and young adult literature, but if I've been able to talk for an hour about all of these things, just imagine how much more is missing from the shelf, and what are the implications for engagement in literacy classrooms all over the US. As I begin the research for the shadow book, I'm thinking about racialized shadows in children's and young adult books. I'm thinking about the shadow tradition of Black children's and young adult literature in the United States. And of course, I'm thinking about this shadow tradition of adults who create, critique, and curate Black children's and young adult literature in the United States. I'll say more about that. Stay tuned. I have been developing a number of seminars around and beyond my book, The Dark Fantastic, where I am trying to practice what I preach about stimulating the future imagination and thinking about ways that we can transform literacy and ELA instruction, as well as thinking about ways to train school, library, and media specialists through my work at Dominican University. And then I just close with one of my favorite illustrations of recent times, Brian Collier's illustration of David Drake, who is artist, poet, ancestor. The book says artist, poet, slave, but he's artist, poet, and ancestor. And I think as we seek and darken futures, we must honor the present and past. It's all connected. Thank you so very much. I am so sad that I'm not there for question and answer. Please do take a screenshot of the final slide and feel free to contact me. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Institute.